Open the Planning Committee meeting of the Colac Otway Shire on 8th of February 2023. I'll begin with the opening prayer. Almighty God, we seek your blessing and guidance in our deliberations on behalf of the people of the Colac Otway Shire. Enable this Council's decisions to be those that contribute to the true welfare and betterment of our community. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians and lawmakers of this land, their elders past and present, and welcome any descendants here today. I'd like to advise that this council meeting is recorded and live streamed with the exception of confidential matters. This includes the public participation sections of meetings. The live stream recording of this afternoon's meeting will be available on the website as soon as practicable. By participating in a planning committee meeting, individuals consent to the use and disclosure of the information they share at the meeting, including any personal and/or sensitive information. Please note, other than an official council recording, no video or audio recording of proceedings is permitted. We have 6 councillors present. We still have a current vacancy. Are there any declarations of interest, please? No declarations of conflict of interest. Councillors, I propose that we move to confirm the minutes from the Planning Committee meeting held on the 7th of December 2022. Do I have a mover? Thanks, Councillor Hanson. Do I have a seconder? Thanks, Councillor White. Is that to be opposed? Thanks, councillors. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. Motion is carried 6-0. Verbal submissions from those applicants and objectors who have confirmed in writing that they wish to speak to their submission will be heard prior to the consideration of the agenda item. A limit of 5 minutes will apply to each submitter. Item 8.1, use and development of 4 group accommodation buildings, 1 caretaker's dwelling and associated works at 710 Blue Johanna Road, Johanna. The purpose of this item is to consider planning permission for the use and development of the land at 710 Blue Johanna Road, Johanna for 4 group accommodation buildings, 1 caretaker dwelling and associated works. We have Mr. Dance as an objector who will speak in person. We have Liz Price via video conference who will speak in support, and we have the applicant Ralph Alfonso on behalf of the applicant in person. Councillors, we'll start off with questions of officers. Do councillors have any questions of officers? I've skipped through that first. Mr. Dance, would you like to come forward as an objector and put your submission to council?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and councillors, for the opportunity to discuss the planned commercial development at 710 Blue Johanna Road in Johanna. I'm here this afternoon as an objector with my 10-year-old daughter representing my family. Unfortunately, my wife could not be present due to her work commitments. I've emphasised to my daughter the privilege of this process, the democratic process, and all of us have the right to have our opinion heard and taken into consideration. We live at 400 Red Johanna Road, and our property is south and west of the development site. We have owned the property for about 14 years and have been living there permanently since 2017. My daughter Claire has spent her entire primary education at Lavers Hill College and is currently in Year 6. She, as we have developed a deep respect and love for our surrounds and are on a journey to reverse the damage inflicted on our land from previous human endeavours in an attempt, to leave the place better than when we found it. Since the proposal to develop accommodation pods and a caretaker's residence was proposed, we have experienced distress and anxiety about the direction that development was taking in our beautiful part of the world. There are too many issues we have with this proposed development to present in 5 minutes, and I'd like to encourage the councillors to read our written objection, which has more detail in it. Our main concern is the very fact that this is a rural conservation zone. It has been designated as such as it is a region of rare amalgamation of scenic beauty with an incredible biodiversity of fauna and flora. It's unique in that it's where the Otway Ridge reaches the coast. It creates a large variety of ecosystems in a very small area. Areas such as these are rare, endangered, and need to be treasured because although it's an old cliche, once it's gone, it's gone. The world is at a very dangerous crossroad of this never-ending desire to grow economically and in wealth, with perpetual development at the expense of the very things we should hold dear to ourselves. It is just not sustainable on a planet with finite resources. The need for regions of nature and space away from the urban sprawls of our cities are paramount to the health of all of us as a species, but we also have a fundamental obligation to protect the remaining fauna and flora that are completely vulnerable to our perceived needs. The overlay of rural conservation zone is at the very heart of why this development should not be given the go-ahead. The reason this region has been designated as a rural conservation zone is obvious. Areas such as these represent only a small amount of the land surface of Victoria. The term conservation is defined as the act of protecting Earth's natural resources for current and future generations. I think we need to focus on that future generation part of the definition, as I think we often lose that perspective that we're not just talking about the here and now, but we are talking about the future. What will the Joanna Valley look like when my daughter is my age, and then again for her children? I understand that development will always be a human trait, but now more than ever it needs to be tempered with careful consideration to protect our natural environment and resources. There is concern that the interpretation of the Rural Conservation Zone guidelines can be twisted and manipulated by clever lawyers and town planners, but I wish to remind councillors of the fundamental aims of conservation. If this approval is given the go-ahead, it creates a precedent for all rural conservation zones in the state of Victoria, not just our valley. Imagine every property in our beautiful location applying to place multiple accommodation units on their properties to cash in on the tourist market. Ironically, it will destroy the very thing that tourists seek when they visit this amazing area. Thank you for the opportunity to express our concerns.
Thanks, Mr Dance. Do councillors have any questions for Mr Dance? Councillor Hart.
Thank you, Mr Dance, for your submission just now. Do you think if there was a reduction in the number of dwellings, that would go any way to allaying some of your concerns? And if that was the case, which dwelling?
I do believe that in that particular area it should be one dwelling per property as a maximum. I think when we look around our surrounds, most people have adhered to that, and the accommodation has been built in sensitive, low impact areas, and as such, of all the areas on that particular site that I think would be relevant to a permanent residence would be the caretaker's unit.
Any other questions? Councillor Hanson.
Yeah, just following on for that, and thank you very much for your submission and for the opportunity to also visit as well. Just on that point, some of the properties around it do have multiple accommodation though, and I just really following on from that, are you opposed to multiple accommodation, or you think that any property, regardless of size, should just have one house on it or one property?
I think the answer to the question is it's probably reached saturation point for your very point that many people have multiple accommodation units. So it's not that many. But when you represent probably the most well-known one that's historically been in the valley is Joanna Cottages. But when you look at their accommodation pods, they are all tucked neatly into well-vegetated areas and are very quite difficult to see from various viewpoints. Just as a follow-up from yesterday's visit, there was one aspect from the silhouette and the view point of view of the landscape that hasn't been addressed in any of the submissions, and we spoke about it briefly yesterday about providing photographic evidence of that. Is that okay if I step forward and provide that?
She did raise that yesterday, Mr Dance. You could circulate that to councillors and to staff, please.
Just as a brief behind that photograph, that's on the Great Ocean walking track between Castle Cove and the Joanna Beach. There's a section that runs probably for about 800 metres downhill, and councillors may know that the walk is mandated that people take it from the east walking west, and that particular part of the walk is a downhill run with very clear views of the Joanna Valley. And of interest, the property in question is very clearly seen all the way down that valley. And it's interesting enough, there are other houses in that photo, but they are all very discreetly hidden away.
Thanks, Mr. Dance. Question, Councillor Finnegan.
How are we going? Rightio. Sorry, would you prefer Mr. Dance or Dr. Dance?
Mr. Swan.
I just wasn't sure. Just wanted to clarify that. Would you mind if I, obviously knowing that the applicants are here in attendance today, would you mind me providing this to them for their consideration as well? I'll do that now.
They might not have seen that vantage point.
Are there any further questions for Mr. Dance? Doesn't look like it. Thank you. Thanks for your submission. I now call on Liz Price to make a submission in support of the application. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Yep, thanks, Chris. I also have just a quick presentation. So really, I was just going to give an update on the Visitor Economy, which I thought was quite important in the light of everything. So I'll just share my screen. I've been advised that that's okay.
That's correct. Share your screen.
Are you able to see that?
Not yet. No, nothing yet, Liz.
It tells me it's sharing. So maybe I'll just speak, Chris, and I can send it through afterwards if you want to see any detail.
Yes, if we've got time to consider it during the hearing, but if you can speak to it, I think councillors will get the gist.
Yep. So thank you for the opportunity. Just for those that don't know me, my name is Liz Price. I'm General Manager of Great Ocean Road Regional Tourism Board. The Regional Tourism Board is a partnership between industry, local government and the state government to facilitate a coordinated and a strategic approach to managing the visitor economy. Our key areas of operation are marketing, visitor management, visitor servicing, development, both the product and the industry, and advocacy. As most people would know, we have gone through quite a difficult time with COVID, but pre-COVID we were really looking at the rate at which the visitor economy was growing and the number of visitor nights was really growing quite excessively. And so it looked by 2030 that we would have somewhere in the vicinity of nearly 12 million nights. That led to further studies to really look at what was the need of accommodation or the need for additional accommodation. And what we had seen through all of those studies over the last 10 years, that there was a shortage already of accommodation, especially in peak periods. And that increased demand was being picked up in many cases with a lack of commercial development, with a proliferation of Airbnb and homestay type properties. And we're seeing that expand even further.
Sorry, Liz, just to interrupt. We've got your shared screen in front of us now.
Terrific. Thanks, Chris. So we're seeing that expand even further. So, we've seen the proliferation of Airbnb, but now we're also seeing things like hip camp, where people are camping on private property and having those sort of, pulling up their caravan and staying in somebody's front yard. And we're also seeing that with a lack of accommodation and the price of accommodation, that gets pushed up when there isn't the supply, an increase in freedom camping. I thought just to recap, before COVID, we were looking at about 7.4 million visitors.
May I ask a question, please?
Yes, Councillor Hart.
Mayor, I'm really troubled and asking for your advice about the submission we're getting. I draw your attention to point 7 in the agenda. The Mayor is to read out the names of those applicants and objectors who have confirmed in writing they wish to make a verbal submission. It says, quote, "These verbal submissions will be made in relation to each respective agenda item and must be directly relevant to the respective agenda item," end quote, and there's a time limit. We're getting a briefing broadly on tourism in the Shire. I just question, and I don't think I've ever seen this before, and I've been around for a little while, as you know, that the appropriateness of getting a broad submission on tourism, which we can get at any time, when the purpose of these submissions, as the agenda says, is to be directly relevant to the respective agenda item. So I would have thought, speaking about the site, that this is a good spot for it, or isn't, that type of thing. But certainly broad data on tourism, I'm really surprised to be hearing this.
Thanks, Councillor Hart. I agree with you. I think you're right. And Liz, you would have heard that, I'm assuming. Your presentation will need to be confined, if you can. Perhaps the slides won't be relevant so much anymore, to speak more specifically to the site and the matter that's directly in front of us.
Mayor, I'm actually not an expert in the site location or design. I was actually just talking to the need that the visitor economy has for additional accommodation, and then especially accommodation that's an immersive experience in the environment. But I do not have the capacity or the expertise to speak quite specifically to a single site and or a single design. That's not our area of expertise as an organisation.
Right, thank you, Liz. I think you made the point about the importance of tourism. If you're unable to assist us with anything more directly related to this site, that may be the end of your submission. But Councillor Hanson has a question for you. Thanks, Councillor Hanson.
Yeah, thank you very much for your submission. I just wanted to ask a question regarding the visitor economy and you know, I guess visitors to the Great Ocean Road. How important is it for those visitors to experience, I guess, the natural beauty of the Great Ocean Road, as opposed, you know, to sort of more built-up areas? Like, what are they visiting for, particularly those areas around Johanna?
Yeah, so the key visitation region for about 90% of visitors is the natural attraction, to enjoy the natural landscape. That is what people come to our region for. And the more and more, to be competitive, what we're seeing is people want to be immersed in that landscape and actually have the opportunity to be quite isolated and see it, not necessarily be in the built-up areas.
Thank you. Any other questions for Liz? Liz, thanks for your attendance this afternoon. It is appreciated.
No worries, thank you.
I now call on Ralph Afonso, one of the applicants, to make a submission.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for your time and your efforts to have a look at this presentation. The site we're talking about is something my partner Liz and I acquired a year and a half ago, approximately, if not slightly longer. It's a 100-acre site, an old farm that has been unmanaged for over 10 years. It has multiple landslips. There's weed infestation, very little natural native vegetation, and even that is under threat, as you would have seen from your site visit. We took that into consideration, and we understand it's in a very important area. That's the reason we purchased that property, and we felt we could improve that. To demonstrate that, the first thing we did was 3D model a full 100 acres of the property in extreme detail that you would have seen. And we've gone to great details, greater than what's required, to give comfort in the lack of impact and to maintain the dominance of the natural landscape, which is complying with the planning scheme. Nowhere in the plan scheme does it state development must be invisible. In fact, there are a number of developments in the same SLO, adjacent to us, across the road from us, and further up Johanna Road, that are arguably have more of an impact. Whether it's one residence, you can then add up multiple facilities on site, and they can equate to almost the same size as what we're proposing, if not larger. The sustainable building side of this proposal, the development will be an exemplar of sustainable building, taking all the learnings that Liz and I have had from the renowned internationally sustainable 5x4 project that I demonstrated to you. Yes, it's a city building, but it's the built form and then also the One Planet Living principles that we used for that was presented at the United Nations, is being used here. This development can be an exemplar, so we can all hang our hats on it. Ecologically, the key is to rehabilitate a degrading site, and it's continuing to degrade. If nothing's done, it's only going to get worse. We're grateful for the dancers for sharing their grant to revegetate the river along one of our boundaries. As per the application, we're doubling the area being planted. In progress, we're managing water, weeds, feral animals, erosion, one of which was late last November on the site. Reintroducing low-intensity, high-quality farming is one of our aims. Economic and environmental sustainable outcomes aren't mutually exclusive. On a 100-acre site, we are putting 5 dwellings, I beg your pardon, totaling 490 square metres. So as far as scale, I think we're making a very small footprint. The letters of support we've had also, and the fact that the Roost are local business, where we have employed over 15 locals to date, and we're getting letters of support from short stay businesses, local hospitality businesses and residents. We're showing that we're working in the community. We're working with Chris Mead, a local businessman, and constructing in Colac. We're also looking to expand that so we can try and address social low-income housing. This directly aligns with the planning scheme, which calls for ecotourism and also calls for low-intensity tourism activities in Johanna. As owners, Liz and I are partners in life and in business. We're not major developers. We're not remote owners. We own 2 parcels of land in Johanna. We run a local business. We employ locals. We're farming on site. We're part of the community. We're volunteers at the CFA, Chamber of Commerce, Land Care, and part of social, short stay and tourism groups. We're embedded in the local community and the broader community and the Shire. In summation, we have a low intensity development containing our forever home and 4 eco-pods. That's an improvement on degrading land. Giving back to the community and to be part of something that can be an exemplar of sustainability we can all be proud of. I'm happy to field any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr Alfonso? Councillor Finnegan.
Thank you for your submission, I should say, Mr Alfonso. Now, obviously, I've circulated to you this photograph taken by Mr Dance. Mr Dance has kindly provided that. Can you please give some context as to what exactly the area we're looking at from your opinion there, if you can?
The exact area we're looking at or where it was taken from, I'm not familiar with that. Yeah, I'm orientating myself. So what we're looking at is a view of the property from several kilometres away, I suspect. It'd be at least 3 kilometres away. I don't know whether it's taken with magnification or not. I can speak to that. I've been a photographer for the last 30 years. I suspect it might be. Where we're looking to place the dwellings, I'm just trying to assess how many we'd see. I can't definitively identify that, but saying that, to give context just on this image, whether it's taken with a magnified camera or not, that looks like well over 1 kilometre of expanse, maybe 1.5 kilometres or so. The dwellings that are going to be in there that I know we'll be able to see is probably 2.5. And if you were square on, which not all of them will be, but the majority will be, you're looking at something 14 metres wide by 4.3 metres high. So as far as context to the SLO, which says whatever we develop shouldn't dominate the landscape, I think it's a very small portion of the landscape that you're going to be viewing from several kilometres away.
All right. And through the chair, if I may, am I able to direct a question to Mr. Dance quickly, just regarding the location where this was taken?
I think for clarification purposes, and it might help Mr. Alfonso in his answer to seek that clarification.
Thank you. Mr. Dance, just as a quick, and this will help in obviously Mr. Alfonso being able to better orient himself, orient, whatever the word is. Is this, I know there was some mention of a view from Point Rotten. Is this where this photograph was taken?
I'm not sure how many councillors here have walked that section of the walk, if any, but it's looking west before you descend down onto the long stretch of sand that you walk on the walk. The descent has, I think you actually counted the steps, something like 200 steps, and during that whole descent you can see right up that valley. And there's low brush there, and there are areas where the trees do obscure the view, but for the most time you are looking directly in that direction as you descend the steps. And as the walkers walk that direction routinely, rather than the other way around, they have it in direct sight.
Cool. And roughly how many kilometres from your house or the site?
I'd say that'd be 2 to 3 kilometres away, and it was taken with an iPhone out of my pocket, no magnification.
No. As I said, I just wanted to see roughly where it was taken from, the distance from the site. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we've done that. And Mr. Alfonso, do you want to talk again to that photo now that you have that extra information?
Yep. As far as distance goes, from the site of the dwellings to the Johanna River mouth is at least 3 kilometres away. So this has to be in excess of there, because that's what I measured this morning on Google Maps and used the measurement tool on there. So I'd say it's at least 3 kilometres away. I can vouch on that. And from that information, I can say this was taken with a telephoto lens or magnified lens, not as your eye would see it. So you'd have a lot wider view as well, which means it'll be, if that's 1 kilometre, it'll be at least 3 kilometres wide, or 3,000 metres of width that you would naturally be viewing.
Thank you. Are there other questions from Mr. Alfonso? Councillor Costa.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Alfonso, thank you for your presentation. The planning officers have provided an alternate motion which contains a whole list of conditions. Have you looked at those conditions? Have you looked at that alternative motion? Are you happy with those conditions?
Yes, we've addressed those conditions, and we accept those conditions to build under.
Thank you. Mr. McNeil, were there some changes to those conditions? Sorry, Chris.
Through you, Mayor, there's been a couple of suggested changes, one from officers, from the ones that were circulated to the applicant prior to the agenda being prepared, And that one was about introducing a requirement that there be fencing off of the area that's culturally sensitive under the Aboriginal Heritage Act. And I did discuss that change this morning with the applicant, and they were comfortable with that requirement being included on the permit on the basis that they were already proposing to fence the, those areas of the site under their land management plan. There was some discussion earlier this afternoon in briefing about whether or not there be a further change to the condition, which is shown up there as 1.2, and that would be about just getting an addendum submitted to council prior to the start of the development to the geotechnical report that just confirms that all the ancillary works, such as any piping or trenching that might need to occur for water pipes, for example, running between the dams, the water tanks and the proposed buildings. So they're the two changes that you'll see before you to the ones that were shown to the applicant.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Costin.
Thank you, Mr. McNeil. Mr. Alfonso, are you comfortable with those two changes?
Sorry, I'm just verifying
Yep.
with the boss.
Take your time.
Yeah, in principle, yes, we do.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Hart, did you have a question? And then Councillor
Yeah, thank
White.
you, Mayor, and thank you for your submission today, and thank you for hosting us yesterday. The question I have relates to your submission just now. You were talking about social housing. Does that have any context to this particular proposal, or was that just perhaps a general remark about
No,
other?
it has direct context to this because what the philosophy of the 5x4 house that I mentioned and so on is about sharing information, and what I've done with the 5x4 house is disseminate the information of that build and open sourced it. Now, as far as this goes, this development goes, we're planning to do exactly the same thing and actually take it a step further, where we want to partner with local businesses, which I've mentioned Chris Mead, and actually try to build low-income housing off the back of the designs that we're using for this development as well. And build locally, use local builders, and include multiple businesses from the area and product from the area as well. So that way we're not just putting all this energy and effort into one development. It's about sharing, and that's been our philosophy, and we've demonstrated from previous projects, and we want to continue that moving forward.
Thank you. Councillor White, you had a question?
Thank you, and thank you for yesterday as well. It was really informative. I think one of the most challenging and unique aspects of the proposal is the fact that the pods are up on stilts, do you call them? Stilts? and it seems to project that out and the visual impact of that. And I'm wondering whether there was any thought to, would it make a difference visually if they were further down, or would the visual impact be the same if you done any work around that?
I think the visual impact wouldn't be any different, because if you cut into the land, you would still only see 4 metres. Because it's raised up with the planting that we're going to have in front, and the fact that the stilts, or not pillars, they're stilts really, because and that's why we chose those, so it has a lower visual impact from distance. Because we're talking about distances of 500 to 800 plus metres that you'd be seeing these dwellings from, bar one. That is raised off the ground. Also, if we cut into the ground, it'd actually have a bigger impact on the environment than having it on those stilts. Because if you actually imagine, without getting too technical, I get told off about this all the time, effectively imagine a tripod. The footings are actually going to be 50mm pipes put into the ground like a tripod, and then those stilts are sitting on top of it. So it's a very light footprint, and that was one of the drivers for doing that as well.
Any other questions? Thanks, Mr Alfonso.
Thank you.
Councillors, do we have any questions of officers? Councillor Costin.
A question for Mr McNeill, thank you. Doug, the recommendation to refuse the application seems to be based on mainly on landscape impact and not on any other issues. So you're quite comfortable that all the other issues associated with this development can be addressed by conditions to a permit?
Through you, Mayor, that's correct. So in the report, we've addressed issues like on-site wastewater disposal being satisfactory. The CFA has consented to the bushfire management approach. The geotechnical assessment satisfies the erosion management overlay in terms of landslide risk. So all of those elements are considered to meet requirements. We did assess the amenity impacts for the adjoining neighbour and recognise that whilst parts of the development would be visible from that development, haven't assessed that the direct amenity impacts would be so significant as to refuse the application. Certainly the key consideration from an officer perspective is what would be the impact of the buildings collectively on the landscape and how it would sit with the controls of the rural conservation zone and the significant landscape overlay and relevant policies around that.
Thanks, Doug. Just to kick us off, can you read out for us the objectives of Schedule 4 of the significant landscape overlay? Have you got those there?
I haven't got them right in front of me.
Yeah, does he need to do that, Councillor Costin?
I can summarise them if you like, Doug.
You could do that in discussion if you like. Have you got a question?
In discussion, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Councillor Hart, you had a question?
Just foreshadowing that I'm ready to move a different resolution.
Thanks, Councillor Hart. Any other questions for officers? Thanks, councillors. Councillor Hart, you flagged an alternative motion.
Yes, Mayor. What I'm moving has some extra words in point 2. So it basically is what starts on page 7 of the agenda. But to point 2, the extra words add comma after the word walk, some areas of beach. And that's immediately prior to an end. So it will read, the proposed development, by reason of its built form and siting, would not protect or enhance the natural features of the landscape, including when viewed from the public visual corridor of the Great Ocean Walk, comma, some areas of beach and other public vantage points. And then it goes on, apart from that, it basically goes on as per the recommendation.
Yes, I think it is the motion to refuse. Just waiting for staff to catch up with the wording.
Yeah, that's
before
right.
we have
It's just
discussion.
a few words different on point 2.
Did you have a look at the wording? I'll get to you in Councillor Costin. Can you have a look at the wording, Councillor Hart?
Yes, providing the rest of the points are as per the recommendation, apart from that few words on point 2, that's what I'm moving.
Thank you, Councillor Costin. Did you have a question of me?
Thank you, Mayor. As you know, I was intending to propose the alternative motion. Am I still able to do that now?
Yeah, thank you. You're flagging. You've got a motion. Should this motion not proceed or be lost?
Thank you.
Councillor Hart, you're happy with the wording of the motion you're proposing?
Yeah, if I get an assurance that all the other clauses are as per the recommendation, then I'm happy to move that. Thank you, Mayor.
Do we have that clarification? Stuff, yep. Indications are that that is the case, Councillor Hart. So there's a motion on the table, councillors. Is there a seconder for the motion? Is there a seconder for the motion, councillors? Councillor Hart, there's no seconder for that motion, so that is lost. Councillor Costin, you have
Thank you,
an
Mayor.
alternative?
I'd like to propose the alternate motion to issue a permit subject to the long list of conditions that commence on page 152 of our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Staff, can we have that up on the screen when you're ready? Yeah, Councillor Costin, the what you're proposing, could you have a look at that up on the screen? It includes the wording around the fencing and considering all ancillary works and so forth.
If I can have an assurance all the other words are the same as in the council agenda? Yep. Yep. That's fine.
Thank you. You're happy. Councillors, there's a motion proposed by Councillor Costin. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Finnegan. Is it to be opposed? Councillor Costin.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm probably going to be a bit confused here. It's been a long day getting on the road early to get up here for briefings. What we have is really a consideration of the landscape impact of the development on a site, which is a beautiful site, but it's already degraded. It's got plenty of weeds. It's not a pristine site. Our officers have interpreted the planning scheme, in particular the significant landscape overlay, in the way we expect, and our officers are notoriously conservative in this, and I don't mean that in a harsh way, because that's what we expect of our officers in interpreting the planning scheme. But as councillors, we have the opportunity to look a little bit broader than the planning scheme, and we can weigh up the impacts on the landscape against the potential economic development that the proposal offers. And in this case, in my view, and I hope the view of other councillors, is that the net benefit to council, and the overall net benefit to council, is best served by allowing this development to proceed. And as I said, it's really a subjective assessment we have to make. Looking at it on site and looking at the various photo montages and models that have been provided, I wasn't offended, I wasn't confronted by the visual impact of the proposal, and I was pleased to see the extent of planting that was proposed around each of the dwellings. Now, I know, and I'm also sympathetic to the objectors, and I understand some of the objections, particularly in relationship to the landscaping, and I've had experience in and around Apollo Bay of replanting quite a few acres on blocks which are almost on the Great Ocean Road. So I know how hard it is to keep going. But the applicants have proposed to harvest, or to get one of the local organisations to harvest Indigenous seeds that are local to the area, and we can expect the maximum success rate from that. I'm also impressed by the intent of the applicant to use a local builder to build the modules. So the modules would be built in Colac and transported on site. And I know there's considerable interest from others around, and we've got another accommodation provider in the audience here today who's very interested in the outcomes of this modular build proposal. And also, we can expect that method of building to decrease in price fairly quickly and become more affordable and potentially more available for social housing. That business building in Colac also would employ local people. It would draw on local suppliers also. So overall, the net benefit, the economic benefit that can be achieved by the development, I see as outweighing the impact on the landscape which has been raised by the objectors. So I urge councillors to vote to issue a permit subject to these conditions. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Costin. Councillor Finnegan? Yeah, I don't think you reserved. Yep.
Sorry, yeah, I reserve. Sorry.
Any other councillor? Councillor Finnegan? Yeah, Councillor Hart, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. This site's in an area that's a key tourist destination. The significant landscape overlay that applies to the site and the rural conservation zoning seek to reflect and protect the landscape values of the area. When making a decision on applications in such a sensitive environment, many reports and comments are made to do with bushfire, construction, comments from objectors, supporters, tourism organisations, and comments about landscaping matters. Various stakeholders have a say and are typically interested in one or another element of the proposal. Our responsibility is to consider the application in its entirety. We can't just tick it off because the proposal meets one or another element. Many aspects of this proposal by themselves may be dismissed by some as minor concerns, but collectively it builds a picture of a proposal that goes too far as there are too many aspects that fail to meet the planning scheme objectives. Some of these units will appear to be on the ridgeline. The location of dwellings, especially 1, to some extent 2 and 4, the bold colour, which could have been softened to blend in better with the environment but hasn't, the construction of the dwelling on stilts. Dwelling 1 will be 9.2 metres off the natural ground level, consisting of 4.9 metre high stilts and a 4.3 metre high structure. Page 115 of the agenda shows that height. The colour, inappropriate of those locations, it gives the appearance of being on the ridge line, should lean council towards one of refusal. With some of these issues addressed, a different outcome might be justified. There are several vantage points from which these dwellings will stand out on the ridge line. Driving down Blue Johanna Road, passengers will look over to look at the ocean, will have dwelling 4 plonked in the middle of that vista. At least one of the dwellings can be seen by the beach, from the beach, despite comments to the contrary. From the location of proposed dwelling 1, a lengthy part of the beach can be seen, and given the 9.2 metre high structure will stand out when looking from the beach. The requirement to maintain a defendable space to meet bushfire overlay requirements is contradicted by the need for landscaping to conceal the excesses of the buildings on stilts. When you have contradictory requirements to meet overlays, that should lead you to considering rejecting the proposal. Mayor, I do a bit of bushwalking in Australia and New Zealand. I know how a small picnic shelter or hut can stand out in a distant hill in the landscape, especially if the colour contrasts with the environment. These dwellings are 14 metres wide, much larger than a picnic shelter. If council approves these dwellings once built, it's likely to be the sort of the development where the public will look and say, how was that approved? Who approved that on those ridge lines? Because putting the whole package together, at least some of these dwellings will stand out inappropriately in the landscape
Time, Councillor Hart,
and
can you
won't be
hurry along?
concealed by the vegetation due to the need to maintain defendable space. And when you consider the entirety of it, we should reject this application.
Thanks, Councillor Hart. Any other councillor? Councillor Finnegan? Councillor Hanson would like to speak.
I'd like to thank all the submitters today, and I'd also like to thank the applicant and the dancers for hosting us on their properties yesterday. The officers have assessed this proposal, and their recommendation was to reject the proposal based on that sort of paraphrasing that the pods will be detrimental to the landscape of the area. We've heard a number of reasons why the proposal should go ahead, and a number of them certainly centred around the economic benefit. We've also heard from the applicants about past projects that they have done, and they are certainly are admirable, and even about, even the proposed development of these pods and potentially using local contractors and the opportunities for the designs in the future, of what that kind of design might be used for, whether it's affordable housing or social housing. But I sort of put all those things aside because it is an absolute beautiful area, and although the land might be degraded, the site is magnificent and it's pristine, and that's why it makes the decision on this application really challenging, because on one hand I very much see, a great opportunity, and I think that the pods where they're sited do have the opportunity, to fit within the landscape. I do have a concern about pod 1, about the height of it. I think there might have been some suggestions to possibly site some of the pods, more into the hillside. And so it makes it really difficult to make a decision on this property, but it does fit within the planning scheme. There are plenty of properties around the area. It is a large site of 100 acres. I think the opportunity to revegetate the site will be really challenging, and that was really certainly became very obvious when we walked around the two properties, the objector and the applicant. It's going to be a very long process to revegetate the site, so trees surrounding the pods, are going to take a very long time to get up, and they're probably not going to play a really significant role in sort of hiding the pods, if that's probably not the right word. But that said, I am going to support the project. I think that it does go a way to fit within the landscape, and I think that what's become really hard with this application is it becomes very subjective and very grey, because it is such a beautiful area. It really does weigh on you, the decision that you have to make. But it is a beautiful area that many people want to visit and many people want to experience, and I think these pods sort of open up that opportunity, and they are small, and I think that they can fit within the landscape.
Thanks, Councillor Hanson. Councillor White.
Not to repeat what everybody else has said, and to also say thank you to both, and to reiterate what Kate said in terms of the challenge of the decision making and the complexity of the decision making, and I think really making us as councillors really do our work at the moment. This has been one of the more, and a very interesting challenge as well. I think going out onto the site really was very instructive and very informative and very important to enable us to make the right decision. I feel confident that the intention is to improve the site. It has been very degraded, and there is clear intention to rehabilitate and improve the site, and that's one of the things that's really important for me. I think the proposed accommodation is quite an exciting concept for our region, and something that is very contemporary, and it does challenge us in the way it sits on the site. But I think visual impact is in the eye of the beholder, and to some people visual impact is an interesting thing and can be add to the landscape. To others, it's the opposite, and they don't have the same experience. So I sort of feel that visual impact can go either way, and it can be interesting or negative. So I think the support by the local community is important. Even though they're taking it from a business perspective, they live in that environment and they understand that environment, and I'm sure they've thought carefully about whether or not this is going to enhance what's offered down there. So yes, I will be supporting this.
Thanks, Councillor White. Councillor Finnegan.
Yeah, not to expand too much upon what has been said by everyone else, but obviously we thank both the applicant and Mr. Downs for coming through and making their submissions today. Sorry, I'm just having a mental blank. I do apologise. I think that there's been a lot to consider in this matter, and it is something that, as has been said by the councillors, the visual impact, I think, is subjective and on a per-person basis. What one person may consider to be unsightly, others may consider to be beautiful, and that's just the way things work. I think it's important that we don't seek to, deny things just on the basis of how they may look, that we don't seek to rule things out just on the way they are on paper, and that's why I think it was important for us to go out on site and consider how things looked from multiple vantage points. But at the end of the day, I am coming down on the side of supporting, approving, I guess. So, yeah.
No worries. Thanks, Councillor Finnegan. Councillor Costin, right, a reply?
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry? Thank you. Councillor Hanson, Councillor White are correct. This is quite challenging. We have spent a lot of time looking at this. I've gone back to the objectives of the significant landscape overlay. And if I can tick them off, protect Indigenous and native vegetation. Well, we know there's not much there, but we know the applicant is proposing to re-establish Indigenous vegetation, to maintain the rural qualities of the hinterland, including vegetation features. Again, the applicant is proposing to reinstate vegetation features, to ensure that the buildings and structures are scattered throughout the landscape in the hinterland, and these 5 dwellings are scattered throughout the landscape, and to retain the dominance of the natural landscape on the hill faces and ridges throughout the precinct. And I think the scale of these 5 small dwellings certainly doesn't diminish the dominance of the natural landscape, which is quite striking. And what particularly swayed me was the fact that Parks Victoria didn't object to the application. Now, Parks Victoria are custodians of the national estate, so to speak. One of their objectives.
Point of order.
Point of order's been called, Councillor Costin. Councillor Hart.
The right of reply is not meant to introduce new information. It's meant to be replying to points made, and the very reason for that is because other speakers then have an opportunity to respond to it. Councillor Costin is introducing new information.
Thank you. Councillor Hart is right. Councillor Costin.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll move away from Parks Victoria, who didn't object, then thank you. Councillor Hart raised a number of quite valid concerns, and those concerns have been assessed by the officers, by our officers, and they are comfortable that those concerns can be addressed by conditions to a planning permit. Thank you.
Thanks, councillors. I'll now call for a vote. All those in favour? Against? The motion is carried 4-2. Division's been called by Councillor Hart. All those in favour? Councillor Costin, Councillor White, Councillor Finnegan, Councillor Hanson. Against? Councillor Hart, Councillor Potter. Thank you, councillors. We only have one item left, but that's been difficult for everyone. Are we happy to keep moving, or did you want a couple of minutes? Keep moving? Councillors, we'll move on to item 8.2, Development Plan DP05, address of 6230 and 6280 Gradation Road, Apollo Bay. The purpose of this item is to consider the amended development plan for 6230 and 6280 Gradation Road, Apollo Bay. Verbal submissions were heard for this matter at the Planning Committee meeting held on the 7th of December 2022. Councillors, do we have any questions of officers? Councillor Hart.
Thanks, Mayor. I've got two questions. Perhaps if I ask them both and you can decide how we go with them. Is that all right?
Yeah, that'll be all right.
Okay. The first one relates, my understanding is that there's no requirement in the staging that the roads or the proposed roads through to Mariners Lookout Road have to be built. In other words, that the whole development could be completed without that road being built. And the other issue goes to the Owners Corporation and trying to understand who these people are who are responsible for managing the bushfire area and the landslip area.
Thanks, Mr McNeil.
Thank you. I'm happy to answer both questions. The first one is that, yes, you're correct in that it is possible under the proposed plan as has been presented to Council for all of the development on this site to be constructed without there being the adjoining subdivision constructed, providing an alternative access point out to Mariners Lookout Road. Although ultimately there is an approved development plan and planning permit for that adjoining land which does show that through access. And so it's envisaged that whilst the timing of the two developments may occur differently, that over the medium to long term there would be certainly that arrangement in place. Council's infrastructure staff have assessed the plan for this site and are comfortable that it could proceed in that manner without the alternative access being provided in the short term. The second one is that the proposal does include an owners corporation being responsible for some areas to the north of the residential development, and that's particularly to include the areas that have to be managed for bushfire hazard to the standard that's required to protect the dwellings that butt onto that area, and the second part of it is landslide mitigation measures. So there's some very steep topography of the land that doesn't form part of the residential development above the site, and there's some very specific measures that will need to be put in place to make sure that that risk is mitigated suitably for the residents who would build houses below that slope. And again, we've assessed that is being appropriately dealt with through in that way, and we think it's appropriate that an owners corporation manage that risk on behalf of the beneficiaries. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Sorry, Councillor Hart.
Thanks, Mayor. Just on the Owners Corporation and in the context of the landslide mitigation measures, wouldn't that be more appropriate as a council responsibility, perhaps with an extra rate or what have you? Won't these people on the Owners Corporation, will they necessarily be qualified or experts on those sorts of issues?
Through you, Mayor, it isn't I guess it's not a common arrangement that's being proposed here, but it is one that's been looked at very carefully, initially by VCAT in the hearing of the initial development plan that was ultimately refused, and then again in this scenario. And we believe as a principle that the people who are building houses within this development are the beneficiaries of the mitigation measures that are being proposed, and that therefore they should be the ones that pay for and ultimately are responsible for managing that over the longer term. I guess council has to be very careful, whatever the scenario that comes before you. It doesn't need to be a planning application, it could be something else. It's always about minimising what the long-term cost to the community is of these things. In this case, it's considered appropriate that that it is managed by an owners corporation. And whilst the people who own houses abutting the development that are within that owners corporation may not have expertise in landslide risk or bushfire management, it'll be very clear in the arrangements that are put in place when the planning permit's issued, and that's the stage at which these measures will be specifically outlined and approved. They'll be clearly aware of what their responsibilities are, and they'll have to take out relevant insurance and manage the land so that insurers are satisfied that they're dealing with it appropriately. So, and from an office perspective, we're comfortable with the arrangements as proposed.
We'll give Councillor Costin a go. Councillor Costin.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr McNeil, I understand we are in discussions with the applicant on the provision of social housing also. Can you give us some detail of that?
Through you, Mayor, yes, there has been discussions held with the owner of the land in respect of whether they'd be prepared to, through development of the site for residential housing, provide some of those allotments for social housing, and we believe that there's been some positive indications that that would be something they'd be prepared to entertain, and officers are still talking to them about what that could look like. There's certainly no obligation on the owner to provide land for social housing with the development, but it's certainly a very positive thing that the developer is looking at doing that voluntarily as a show of goodwill to the community around increasing social housing for Apollo Bay.
Councillor Hart, did you have another question?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Thank you for the answer about the cost and the owners corporation bearing those costs. Is it an option that council could take on that responsibility and recoup those costs through a special rate, much like people who have a curbside waste collection pay an extra rate and so forth? Couldn't it be a mechanism whereby the responsibilities of the owners corporation, which is maintenance of that the landslip and bushfire area, is taken on by council, but that the costs are recouped through a rate for the properties that benefit from that arrangement? I mean, it comes to mind Tirrangower drainage scheme, which we have for properties that are drained and paid an extra rate in rural properties. So some sort of mechanism like that. Is that an option?
Through you, Mayor, I'm probably not the best person to respond to how that arrangement might be met through a rate. So I'm not sure whether the General Manager of Corporate Services might be able to talk to that, or the CEO, but I think if there was to be consideration by council of going down that path, I think the preference would be to defer the item so that there can be discussions held with the applicant about what that would mean, and for our staff to get further advice about what the option is there. But as I said before, that's not what the officers are recommending.
Councillor Costin.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr McNeil, there was some of the objectors were concerned about the one access onto the Great Ocean Road, and the subdivision shows some other alternative outlets to a block of land which is yet to be subdivided. How will that work? Will the applicant be able to apply for subdivision to subdivide into all those lots before the adjoining land that provides the alternative access be constructed?
Through you, Mayor, yes, that would be true, is that there's no proposal at this stage to limit the capacity of the developer of this land to fully develop the subdivision and rely on the single access onto the Great Ocean Road that's proposed before the adjoining development is constructed. There is an alternative access for emergency access that's been created on the plan, but that's obviously only for an emergency access.
Councillor Costin.
I'm just thinking the worst case scenario. So if that neighbouring development never gets built, and we've still only got one access, an emergency access, for the whole subdivision, or can we impose some staging requirements in the future?
Through you, Mayor, I think it's reasonable to assume that this land next to the site would be developed. It's zoned residential. It has a very similar overlay that requires a development plan over it before you can subdivide, and we have actually approved a development plan for that site. And there's an issued planning permit that allows subdivision, and my understanding is that the owner is actively initiating efforts to move towards starting to subdivide. So I think council should have every confidence that that land will be developed in the short term, and that it won't be some long-term outcome that's in question. And I think, we have talked to councillors previously about, when discussing this issue, about how a comparable scenario is the Wayuna estate in Eliminite, south of Colac, in that there's been a subdivision that's been developing over years there. There's land next to it where there'll be an alternative entrance onto Colac Lavers Hill at some point in the future, and we're now actively looking to rezone that land to provide that connection. And it may well be 5-7 years or so before you might see that connection realised, but over time you've seen that development occur at the Wayuna estate and provide housing supply for Colac, and the alternative access to that site will obviously be delayed, but ultimately will be realised. And that estate's operated as it has adequately in that period of time, and will benefit from the second access eventually, but it hasn't been to the detriment of that estate that it's just had that single access for a short period of time, relatively.
Councillor Costin.
Thank you, Mr. McNeil. You've made two additions here to the, or one addition, which is about a block on the northern side. Can you just talk us through why that addition has been made?
Through you, Mayor, that one of the submitters had expressed concern about the northeasternmost lot within the subdivision being in very close proximity to the boundary of the land and in proximity to the property that they have adjoining the property and their dwelling. And they were concerned that the bushfire protection measures that would need to be undertaken on the land to provide for the requirements of the permit for this subdivision would have implications for their land. And so in talking to the developer for this site, they have agreed to remove that allotment and for that land to be incorporated into the reserve that was proposed next to it. So that does increase the land that would be available for bushfire protection on this site and not the adjoining land. And I believe that would satisfy that submitter's concern in that respect.
Any other questions? Thanks, councillors. The officers have provided a recommendation with a report for our consideration. Does any councillor wish to move a motion in relation to this matter? Councillors? It's pretty important. Thanks, Councillor Costin. Could I have a seconder for that motion, please? Councillors, I'm not going to do it from the chair. Someone put up their hand. Thanks, Councillor White. Is it to be opposed? Thank you. Councillor Costin.
Thank you, Mayor. This proposal for a development plan for the subdivision has been around for a long time and been reviewed by VCAT. It initially attracted quite a few, or many submissions actually, and it's why it went to VCAT. VCAT listened to those submissions, those objections, and has requested the developer to make some modifications, quite a few modifications to the proposal for a development plan. And I should stress this is a development plan, which is separate from an application in the future for a subdivision. It was advertised again for consultation. There were still one or two objections, and I think they were concerning the limited access to the Great Ocean Road, lack of a path through to the campground, a walking path, and a lot which had the defendable space implications on the neighbouring property that Mr. McNeil just talked about. So I'm And I'm pleased to hear that officers are in consultation with the developer about the provision of social housing. And I think we could be looking at 7 dwellings for social housing in the development. I think it has been, most of the concerns have been addressed in one way or another. The outstanding concern is just the prominence of the subdivision as you drive into Apollo Bay, but it has been zoned as residential, so there was a rezoning, and that rezoning also went through a consultation phase also. So you might say this has been around and around the mulberry bush quite a bit. The buffer zone from the Great Ocean Road was one area in particular that VCAT requested be widened, and it has been widened substantially, and I expect the visual impact from the Great Ocean Road will be reduced. So I urge councillors to vote for this recommendation proposed by officers. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Costin. Councillor White? Any other councillor? Councillor Hart?
Thanks, Mayor. I do acknowledge that what we have before us today is a significant improvement on what we dealt with several years ago. I think it was about 2017 or 2018 VCAT looked at it. There's a better setback from the Great Ocean Road, better lot layout, and there is that secondary emergency access on this. So I do acknowledge that this plan is an improvement on what we considered previously. I also acknowledge that if there was some social housing out of that, that would be a positive out of this. Where I have some concerns, and I don't think my concerns will be any great news to anyone, is that the access to the secondary or the second access through Mariners Lookout Road, there's no requirement for at least the last stage to be dependent on that. So you could have the entire subdivision completed and still no second access. And if you think, well, what does it matter about a second access? Mr McNeil mentioned the estate in the Limonite area that has been raised with us many times over the years, where there's a major subdivision with only one road in and one road out. And it is true that hopefully soon, or eventually, there will be a second access. But that's been raised to us as an issue. It can be an issue if there's some sort of emergency that takes place. And unlike the site near Colac, this particular site has additional risks of bushfire and landslide. So that lack of the staging to require that road is built before the final stage at least can be built is a concern. The other concern I have is the owners' corporation. That you have the risk of landslide. You look around and see the various things that have happened in Australia with flooding and landslips, and I acknowledge this is not subject to flooding, but it is a risk, a major risk of landslide. And you're going to have a well-meaning owners' corporation, which could be everyday mums and dads who own one of these blocks, taking on that significant risk through the committee. If anyone's injured from a landslide and the coroner comes looking for someone to blame, these well-meaning people on this owners' corporation could potentially be at risk. I think that we should be looking at whether that is something that should be taken on by council and funded by a rate for the properties that benefit from that. I think there would be greater expertise from that. And if this were to be voted down, then I would suggest that we defer it just for the purpose of teasing out that issue of the owners' corporation concern. So they're the concerns I have, but in raising those, I do acknowledge this is a significant improvement on where we were in 2017 or 2018 on this one.
Thanks, Councillor Hart. Any other councillor? Councillor Finnegan.
I think that this proposal will go a long way to addressing the critical housing shortage we have in Apollo Bay and down the coast. I like the idea that there will be there will be space set aside for social housing as part of the proposal, and I'll be supporting it on that basis. So.
Thank you. Any other councillor? Councillor Hanson.
Just quickly, it's good to see actually this proposal back at council, because it was one of my earliest planning committee meetings, and if my memory serves me correctly, I think it was refused at council, and council did have a number of concerns around the setback, and a number of those concerns that councils have been addressed. So I think I'll agree with the other councillors that it's a much improved development plan, and I will be supporting it.
Thank you. Councillor Costa and Councillor Hart raised some concerns. Did you want to write a reply? There are any concerns? Okay, thank you. Councillors will now put the motion to a vote. All those in favour? Thank you. Against? Thanks, Councillor Hart. The motion is carried 5-1.
Division?
Division's been called. Councillors, all those in favour? Councillor Costa and Councillor White, Councillor Finnegan, Councillor Hanson, Councillor Potter. Against? Councillor Hart. Thank you, councillors. That concludes the Planning Committee for Colac Otway Shire for today. Thanks for your work. Thanks, officers.